I reviewed the consent form from a local counseling agency called couc501 Counseling Services. To start off, the consent form spoke of psychologist-client service agreement, which was ultimately a rundown of what was contained in the consent form and its parameters. The form continues to mention the psychological services and the pros and cons to psychotherapy, and that there are no guarantees to it working. The next section of the document covers appointments, their duration, frequency, rescheduling, and the consequences of missing appointments. Specifically, this form mentioned that in the case of a missed session, the client is still required to pay the cost of that missed session. The next section covered is the cost of the sessions and any work that is required of the counselor, such as writing reports, telephone calls over 15 minutes, and attendance of court dates. Although the specific fee was not stated within the consent form, it must be in accordance with my state's, Pennsylvania's, rules and regulations that require the fees are of a fair and reasonable price. This part of the consent form is derived from the ACA Code of Ethics in Section A10C, which is the required section to establish fees with the client. Additionally, the Code A10D is also relevant as it covers the non-payment of fees that the counselors have the right to reclaim them. The next section of the consent form covers insurance. The form states that insurance is accepted by the counselor, but there may be potential issues that arise while dealing with insurance, such as having to pay for the sessions out of pocket if insurance does not cover the sessions, and that the counselor may need to divulge information to the insurance agency that the client will continue to be covered. Pennsylvania does not have any direct rules stating that they must accept insurance, but they still have to accept clients and work out a payment method or take responsibility to refer them to another counselor. A study done in 1991 by Richard Frank stated that due to the rise of costs in mental health insurance costs, many people are not receiving the proper psychiatric care that they need. While there are no ACA codes that directly pertain to insurance, I still believe that it would fall under codes A10C and A10D, which talk about establishing payment and non-payment contingencies. The next section covers record keeping. The form states that the counselor is responsible for holding confidential records for the client, and the counselor is required to give the documents if the client requests it. However, since it is written in professional writing, the counselor recommended that they review the notes together or have another trained counselor interpret them. Pennsylvania law requires that all records are to be kept for at least 5 years in a secure location. This ties in with Code B6 and most of its subsidiaries, such as B6A, which allows the counselor to create documentation, Code B6B, which ensures that the documents are confidential, as well as Code B6E, which allows the clients to request their documentation from the counselor. The next section covers confidentiality. The form states that the records will be kept confidential, but explains the limits of confidentiality where they must break it. For example, some instances are the duty to warn and protect if they believe that someone is in imminent danger, abuse of children and vulnerable adults, and substance abuse while the client is pregnant. This ties into Pennsylvania's requirement for all counselors to be mandated reporters and report instances of abuse or harm when imminent. This ties into the ACA codes B1C and B1D, which explain the counselor's respect for confidentiality and the limits in which the counselor is not able to keep session information confidential. The final section talks about parents and minors. The form states that counselors will share information with the parents or guardian when the child is 13 years old and younger, but once the child turns 14, the counselor is no longer able to speak about sessions with the parents. Pennsylvania states that children who are 14 years and older are able to seek counseling without the permission of parents. This section is relevant to the ACA codes B5A, B5B, and B5C, which state that the counselor will protect the confidentiality of their minor clients when able, that the parents of the minors below 13 are entitled to be a part of the therapeutic process, and that the counselor is allowed to break confidentiality to parents of children who are 13 and below. The closing remarks of the form state that if the client is unhappy about the content in their sessions, that they should feel free to speak to the counselor about it so that it can be rectified. The form ends by saying that the therapist will not have any friendships or sexual relations with the client after their sessions are terminated. In Pennsylvania, counselors are not allowed to have sexual or social relations with their current or former clients, and the ACA Code of Ethics states in Code A6E that counselors will not form professional relationships with their clients.